The land came to Beatrice Holt the way a joke arrives, wrapped in enough politeness that you have to look twice to understand what has been said. Her husband Walter had died in March, after 41 years of marriage, and in the settling of his estate, which had been handled by his two siblings with the particular efficiency of people who had been waiting for an opportunity to demonstrate their efficiency, there had been one item that nobody else wanted. 5 acres of rocky, overgrown pastureland on the edge of Holloway, Tennessee, that Walter's father had owned and that had passed to the 3 siblings jointly, and that Walter's brother Dale had described, at the family meeting where the estate was divided, as not worth the property taxes. "You take it, B," Dale had said, with the specific generosity of a man giving away something he considers worthless. "You're not doing anything with your time now anyway. Might as well have something to look at." Beatrice was 69 years old. She had spent the months since Walter's death doing the things a widow does in a small town where everyone knows everyone, receiving the casseroles, attending the church functions where people checked on her with kind and slightly anxious faces, managing the particular quiet of a house that used to have 2 people in it and now had 1. She had not been doing anything with her time, in the sense Dale meant it. She had been grieving, which is its own occupation and does not announce itself as productive, but is not nothing. She had taken the 5 acres because refusing it would have required more energy than accepting it, and because some quiet part of her, even in the fog of that first spring of grief, had recognized that land, even land nobody wanted, even land that her in-laws considered a consolation prize too small to argue over, was still land. It was still something. And Beatrice Holt, in the particular clarity that sometimes accompanies loss, had begun to understand that something was what she needed. Her sister-in-law Carol, Dale's wife, had said it more directly at a family dinner 2 weeks after the estate meeting. Not unkindly, but with the specific carelessness of someone who believes they are simply stating a fact. She had said, "It's sweet that you want the land, B, but what are you going to do with it at your age? 5 acres is a lot of work. You're 69. Maybe it's better to just sell it to the Hendersons next door and put the money towards something easier." Beatrice had not argued. She had said she would think about it. But she had driven out to the 5 acres the following Saturday morning, alone, in Walter's old truck which she had kept, because she could not yet bring herself to sell it. And she had walked the rocky, overgrown pasture in the April sunshine, and she had thought about the word easier, which Carol had used with the assumption that easier was what a 69-year-old widow should want. She did not want easier. She had spent 41 years building an easier life with Walter, a good and comfortable life that she did not regret. And now Walter was gone, and easier did not feel like comfort anymore. It felt like disappearing. What she wanted, standing in that rocky field with the wind coming across it the way it had probably been coming across it for 10,000 years, was something that would require her. Something that needed her hands and her attention and her remaining years, in a way that the casseroles and the church functions and the careful, kind concern of people checking on the widow did not. If you have ever been told, kindly or otherwise, that you were too old for what you wanted to do, if you have ever been handed something as a consolation that turned out to be exactly what you needed, if you believe that the years after 60 are not the closing chapter, but sometimes the truest one, then stay with us. Because what Beatrice Holt built on those 5 acres of land that nobody wanted did not just prove her in-laws wrong. It became one of the most respected herb farms in the state of Tennessee. And it gave her back a version of herself she had set aside for 41 years of being, happily and completely, someone else's wife. This is her story. Before she was Walter Holt's wife, Beatrice had been Beatrice Fenwick, the daughter of a woman named Ruth Fenwick, who had kept what the family called a kitchen garden, but what was, in fact, something more particular than that. A serious and knowledgeable cultivation of herbs and medicinal plants that Ruth had learned from her own mother, and that stretched back, through the women of that family, further than anyone had bothered to formally trace. Beatrice had grown up with the smell of drying herbs in the attic of her childhood home in Holloway, with her mother's careful explanations of what each plant did and how it was prepared and when it should be harvested, with the specific quiet authority of a woman who understood plants the way some people understand music, not as information memorized but as a language fully absorbed. Ruth Fenwick had treated half the ailments in Holloway with what she grew in her garden, In the years before that kind of knowledge had been pushed to the margins by the convenience of pharmacies and the suspicion that anything not manufactured was somehow less legitimate. People had still come to her, quietly sometimes, because by the 1960s it was not entirely fashionable to admit you trusted an herbalist over a doctor, but they came. Beatrice had been her mother's primary student, the daughter who paid attention in the way the others did not, who could identify 40 plants by their leaves, alone, by the time she was 12, who had her own small bed in the garden by 14, where she grew chamomile and lemon balm, with the careful attention her mother had taught her. She had intended, as a young woman, to study herbalism formally. There were programs, even then, modest ones, that offered something more structured than what she had learned at her mother's side. Then she had met Walter Holt at a county fair when she was 22, and Walter had been kind and steady and deeply in love with her in the unhurried way of a man who knew what he wanted and was patient about getting it, and within 2 years they were married, and Walter's work as a land surveyor had taken them, over the following decade, to 3 different towns across Middle Tennessee before they settled permanently in Holloway, close enough to Beatrice's family, but far enough that the kitchen garden of her childhood became something she visited rather than tended. She had not stopped gardening entirely. She had kept a modest herb bed at every house they lived in, smaller each time as the children came and the demands of a young family compressed the available time and attention. But the serious study, the formal program she had once imagined, had quietly receded into the category of things she had meant to do, the way certain intentions recede when a full life arrives and requires you elsewhere. Ruth Fenwick had died in 1989, when Beatrice was 34, and the knowledge that had not been formally passed on, the specific preparations, the precise timing, the particular wisdom that lived in her mother's hands and had never been fully transferred to paper, had gone into the ground with her, except for what Beatrice had absorbed as a girl and carried, half dormant, through 3.5 decades of a full and busy life as Walter Holt's wife. The land Walter's father had owned sat on the eastern edge of Holloway, bordered by the Henderson farm on one side and a stretch of undeveloped woodland on the other, with a small seasonal creek running along the back boundary that had been the reason, generations ago, someone had thought the parcel worth claiming, and that had been, for the past 30 years, the reason nobody else in the family wanted it. The creek made the land prone to flooding in the wettest months. The soil, where it was not rocky, tended toward clay. The 5 acres had grown nothing more ambitious than scrub and broom sedge, since Walter's father had stopped running cattle on it in the 1970s. Beatrice walked it in April, 2 weeks after Carol's comment at the family dinner, with the particular attention she had not realized she still possessed, until she was standing in the middle of an overgrown field, reading the ground the way her mother had taught her to read it 50 years earlier. She noted where the clay gave way to better drainage. She noted the slope of the land toward the creek and what that slope would mean for water and for frost. She noted which sections received full sun through the day and which were shaded by the woodland edge in the afternoon. She was not thinking, yet, about what she might grow. She was simply looking, the way she had been taught to look, and the looking was its own form of return. She drove home and sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she and Walter had eaten 10,000 meals together, the same table where the casseroles from well-meaning neighbors had been accumulating since March. And she got out a notebook and began, for the first time in over 4 decades, to write down what she remembered about her mother's garden. Not from nostalgia, from the specific and practical motivation of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the walking of that field, that she was going to do something with the land that Carol considered too much for a woman of 69. The notebook filled over the following weeks: plant names, growing conditions, harvest timing, the preparations her mother had made and the conditions they had addressed, as much of it as Beatrice could recover from a memory that had been dormant for 40 years and that surprised her, repeatedly, with how much was still there. The hands remember, her mother had once told her, even when the mind has moved on to other things. Beatrice was discovering that this was true. Her daughter Susan, who was 43 and lived in Knoxville and called every Sunday, asked what she had been doing with herself. Beatrice told her about the land and the notebook and the plan beginning to form. There was a pause on the line. Then Susan said, "Mom, that sounds like a lot of work." Beatrice said, "It is." Susan said, "Are you sure that's a good idea right now, with everything?" Beatrice understood what Susan meant by everything, and she understood that Susan was asking out of love and concern rather than the dismissiveness that had colored Carol's comment. But the answer was the same regardless of the intention behind the question. Beatrice said, "Susan, I have spent 41 years building a life around what your father needed, and what you and your brother needed, and what was sensible for our family. I am not saying I regret a day of it, but I am 69 years old and I have an opportunity to do something I have wanted to do since I was a girl, and I am going to do it." Susan was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, Mom, tell me what you need." She cleared the land herself through the early summer, with the help of a man named Curtis Hale, who did odd jobs around Holloway, and who Beatrice hired for 2 days a week to handle the heavier work: the brush clearing, the rock removal from the section she had designated for the first beds, the general preparation that her 69-year-old body could direct, but not entirely perform alone. Curtis was 34 and had grown up in Holloway and had heard, the way everyone in a small town hears things, about B. Holt's plan to grow herbs on the rocky pasture nobody wanted, and he had opinions about it that he was careful not to share until he had spent a few weeks watching her work. What he saw, over those weeks, was a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. She tested the soil in different sections of the property with a thoroughness that surprised him. She mapped the drainage and the sun exposure with a level of attention he had not expected from someone he had assumed, before he met her, was simply an elderly widow looking for a project to fill her time. By the third week, he had stopped having opinions about whether the plan made sense and started having opinions about how to execute it better, which was a different and more useful kind of involvement. She planted the first beds in late May. Lavender along the section with the best drainage, where the soil leaned sandy enough to suit a plant that resented wet feet. Chamomile and lemon balm in the section near the creek that retained moisture without flooding. Echinacea and calendula in the full sun beds. Comfrey along the shaded edge near the woodland. She planted with the specific knowledge her mother had given her decades before, adjusted for what the soil tests and the drainage maps had told her about this particular land, in this particular place, with its particular history of clay and rock and seasonal flooding. The first season was not, by any objective measure, an unqualified success. The lavender struggled in a wet June that left standing water in sections she had thought were better drained than they turned out to be. The comfrey did beautifully, almost embarrassingly well, growing with the aggressive vigor that comfrey is known for, and that required her to manage it more carefully than she had anticipated. The chamomile bloomed generously, and she harvested it by hand in July, on her knees in the early morning before the heat set in, filling baskets with the small white and yellow flowers and drying them on screens in the old barn that had survived from Walter's father's cattle days. Dale and Carol drove out in August, ostensibly to see how she was getting on, but with the specific quality of people checking on a decision they had expected to fail. Beatrice walked them through the beds, the struggling lavender that she explained she would address with better drainage the following season, the thriving comfrey, the chamomile already dried and stored in jars in the barn, the echinacea just beginning to flower in its first-year growth, which would not produce a harvestable root until its third year, but was establishing well. Carol looked at the rows of beds, the dried herbs in their jars, the careful labeling system Beatrice had developed, and said, with what Beatrice recognized as genuine if reluctant surprise, "This is more than I expected." Beatrice said, "Thank you." Dale said, "What are you going to do with all of it?" Beatrice said, "I am still working that out, but I am going to do something." The second season required her to confront the gap between what she remembered of her mother's practice and what a modern herb business required to be more than a hobby. She had the cultivation knowledge. She did not have the formal training in the regulatory and commercial dimensions of selling herbal products, and she was honest enough with herself, from the beginning, to know that this gap mattered. She enrolled in an online program through a respected herbalism school, studying in the evenings at the kitchen table, where her notebook had first filled with memories of her mother's garden, working through coursework on plant chemistry and proper preparation methods and the specific regulations governing the sale of herbal products in Tennessee. She was, at 70, the oldest student in most of her cohort's discussion forums, a fact that the younger students found variously inspiring and slightly intimidating, based on the messages she received when she posted questions that demonstrated she had been doing the actual work of growing these plants for 2 seasons, while most of her classmates had not yet touched soil. She finished the certification in 14 months. She framed the certificate and hung it in the barn, not the house, because the barn was where the work happened, and that was where she wanted to see it. The third season was when the farm began to look like what it would become. She had corrected the drainage issues that had troubled the lavender, working with Curtis to install a simple system that redirected the worst of the wet season water away from the beds that needed to stay dry. The lavender came in strong in its third year, the way lavender often does once it is properly established, filling 2 full rows with the silvery purple haze that Beatrice had been picturing since that first April walk through the rocky pasture. She began selling at the Holloway Farmers Market that spring, a folding table with her jars of dried herbs and small bundles of fresh lavender, and the printed cards she had made explaining what each product was good for, written with the careful precision of someone who had completed a proper certification and was not going to make claims she could not stand behind. The reception was modest at first. Curious locals, a few of the older residents who remembered Ruth Fenwick and who approached Beatrice's table with the specific recognition of people encountering something they had thought was gone from the world. One of those older residents was a woman named Pearl Whitfield, who was 84, and had been treated by Ruth Fenwick decades before for a chronic digestive complaint that the doctors of the time had not been able to resolve. Pearl stood at Beatrice's table at the farmer's market and looked at the jars and said, "Your mother saved me from a misery that lasted 3 years. I never forgot her." Beatrice said she did not know that. Pearl said, "There is a lot you don't know about what your mother did in this town." She paused. "I am glad someone is doing it again." The business needed a name, and Beatrice spent longer choosing it than she spent on most decisions in her life, because the name was, in a way she did not fully articulate even to herself, a statement about what she believed she was continuing. She settled on Holloway Apothecary Gardens, which honored the town and the practice her mother had quietly maintained there for decades, without ever calling it a business. Susan helped with the website, much the way Claire had helped Frances build hers, because adult children of a certain generation had absorbed the specific skill of helping their parents establish an online presence that the parents themselves had not grown up needing. The website was simple and direct. Photographs of the 5 acres and the lavender rose, and Beatrice herself in the field with her hands in the soil, the certification prominently displayed, the products described with the same careful precision as her farmer's market cards. The local newspaper ran a feature in the 4th year, a reporter named Janet Cobb, who had grown up in Holloway and had heard, through the particular efficiency of small-town information networks, that B. Holt had built something genuinely impressive on the land everyone had considered worthless. Janet drove out on a June morning when the lavender was at its peak and spent 4 hours walking the property and talking with Beatrice about her mother and her certification and the long, unlikely path from a kitchen garden in the 1960s to a working herb farm 60 years later. The piece ran with the headline, "Holloway Woman 73 Builds Thriving Herb Farm on Land Family Called Worthless," and it included a photograph of Beatrice standing in the lavender rows with the specific composure of a woman who has built exactly what she set out to build. The piece was picked up by a regional publication and then by a state agricultural magazine that covered small farm enterprises across Tennessee, and the attention brought a wave of new customers and, more significantly, an invitation from a wellness retailer in Nashville to discuss a wholesale supply arrangement. Beatrice drove to Nashville for that meeting in a dress she had not worn since Walter's funeral, with a binder of her certifications and her growing practices and samples of her products organized with the same precision she brought to everything. The retailer, a woman named Diane Hutchins, who ran 3 wellness shops across Middle Tennessee, listened to Beatrice describe her farm and her practice and said, at the end of the meeting, "I have a lot of suppliers who can sell me herbs. I do not have many suppliers who can tell me, the way you just told me, exactly what is in every jar and why, going back to a specific tradition with a specific person behind it. That matters to my customers. I want to..." Carol came to the farm regularly by the 5th year, not out of the dutiful checking in that had characterized her early visits, but because she had become, somewhat to her own surprise, genuinely interested in what Beatrice was building. She had started taking a few jars home after each visit, then more, then had asked Beatrice to teach her some of the basics, which Beatrice did with the patience of a woman who understood that people change their minds in their own time and that there was no satisfaction in holding Carol's early comment against her. Dale was harder to win over, not because he was unkind, but because admitting he had been wrong required a particular humility that did not come naturally to him. He came around in his own way, eventually, by simply stopping the comments about the land being too much work and starting to ask, when he visited, practical questions about yield and pricing and growing conditions that signaled, without him having to say it directly, that he had revised his assessment. Susan visited from Knoxville more often than she had before her father died, staying for long weekends in the summer when the farm was at its most active, working beside her mother in the lavender rows with a kind of presence that Beatrice recognized as Susan working through her own grief in the company of soil and growing things, which Beatrice understood completely because she had done the same thing. Beatrice's son, Mark, who was 41 and lived in Atlanta and was the more skeptical of her two children in the early months, had been the one who most directly echoed Carol's original concern, the worry that his mother, recently widowed and not young, was taking on more than she should. He came to visit in the farm's third year, when the lavender had come in properly, and the certification was framed in the barn, and the farmer's market table had become a regular and recognized presence in Holloway. He walked the property with his mother, and was quiet for most of the walk, and at the end of it he said, "Mom, I was wrong to worry about this. I should have asked what you needed instead of assuming what you could handle." Beatrice said, "You were worried because you love me." "I understand that," Mark said. "I am still going to worry, but I am not going to worry about this anymore. This is good for you. I can see that now." The thing Beatrice had not anticipated when she walked that rocky field in April of her 69th year was how much of the satisfaction would come not from the growing itself, but from passing the knowledge forward. She had spent 4 decades as the recipient of her mother's teaching, half dormant but never entirely lost, and now she found herself, in her 70s, becoming the teacher in a way that closed a circle she had not known was open. She began offering workshops on the farm in the 5th year, simple Saturday sessions on basic herb identification and preparation that drew a mix of curious locals and serious students from as far as Nashville and Chattanooga. She taught the way her mother had taught her, not from a script, but from the specific living relationship with the plants themselves, walking her students through the beds and letting them touch and smell and ask questions, the way knowledge had always actually been passed between the women in her family, long before anyone called it a curriculum. Among her students in the 6th year was a young woman named Olivia Marsh, 24, who had grown up in Holloway and had moved away for college and had come back, like many people in small towns eventually do, looking for something that the larger world had not quite provided. Olivia took every workshop Beatrice offered and then asked, with the directness of someone who had decided what she wanted, if Beatrice would consider taking on an apprentice. Beatrice thought about it for 2 weeks. Then she said yes. Olivia became, over the following 2 years, the person Beatrice was certain would carry Holloway Apothecary Gardens forward when Beatrice herself was no longer able to walk the rows at 5 in the morning to check the dew on the chamomile. This was not a sad thought. It was, Beatrice found, one of the most satisfying thoughts she had ever had. The understanding that what she had rebuilt from her mother's half-remembered teaching was not going to end with her, that the chain that had been broken for one generation, her own generation of compressed and deferred intentions, was now unbroken again and extending forward. 10 years after Dale had handed her the 5 acres at a family meeting with the offhand generosity of a man giving away something he considered worthless, Beatrice Holt stood at the edge of the lavender rows on a June morning and looked at what the land had become. 5 full acres, every section of it now purposeful. The lavender that had finally found its proper drainage and bloomed each June with the silvery haze that drew visitors from across the region just to walk through it and photograph it. The chamomile and lemon balm beds near the creek. The echinacea, now mature and producing the roots that took 3 years to develop and that formed the basis of the farm's most respected tincture. The comfrey, still vigorous, still requiring the careful management it had required from the first season. Holloway Apothecary Gardens supplied Diane Hutchins's 3 wellness shops and 4 others across the state. It had been featured in 2 more publications since Janet Cobb's original piece, including a feature in a national magazine about women who had built second careers after 60 that had brought visitors from outside Tennessee for the first time. People who drove hours specifically to walk Beatrice's lavender rows and buy from the farm stand that Curtis had helped her build in the 4th year, a proper small structure that had replaced the folding table years before. Olivia ran the farm's daily operations now, with Beatrice still present every morning. Still the one who walked the rows first and noticed what needed attention, but no longer carrying the full physical weight of the work that her 79-year-old body could direct with complete authority, but could not always perform without help. This was not a diminishment. It was the natural progression of a teacher who had built something well enough that it no longer required her hands on every part of it, only her judgment, which remained as sharp as it had ever been. Carol came every week now, not to check on Beatrice, but because she had her own small bed of herbs at home, started under Beatrice's instruction, and liked to compare notes. Dale had become, in his own quiet way, one of the farm's most reliable advocates, mentioning it to anyone who would listen with the specific pride of a man who had been wrong about something and had found, eventually, real satisfaction in admitting it. Pearl Whitfield had died 2 years earlier, at 91, and had asked, in the specific instructions she left for her family, that the flowers at her funeral come from Beatrice's farm. Beatrice had arranged them herself, the lavender and the chamomile that her own mother had once used to ease Pearl's suffering decades before, and she had stood at the funeral and thought about the particular continuity of it. Ruth Fenwick treating Pearl Whitfield in the 1960s, Beatrice growing the same plants on the land everyone said was worthless 60 years later. The flowers at Pearl's funeral closing a circle that had taken most of a century to complete. She stood at the edge of the lavender rows on this June morning, 79 years old, with the smell of the flowers carrying on the same wind that had crossed this rocky field for 10,000 years before she ever walked it. And she thought about the word Carol had used at that family dinner a decade before. Easier. She had not wanted easier then, and she did not regret, now, that she had chosen something harder instead. The years since Walter's death had not been easy. They had been full, which was a different thing entirely, and the difference was the whole of what she had built. If you have ever been told you were too old to start the thing you wanted to start, if you have ever been handed something as a consolation that turned out to hold more than anyone expected, if you believe that the knowledge passed down to us by the women who came before, even when it lies dormant for decades, never entirely disappears, then Beatrice's story belongs to you, because she did not just grow an herb farm on 5 acres nobody wanted. She grew her way back to herself, and then she grew a way forward for someone else to carry what she had carried, the way her mother had once carried it for her. Share this with someone who has been told they are too old, too late, or too far past the moment when the thing they wanted was still possible. Tell them it is not too late. Tell them the hands remember, even when the years have made them forget that they remember. Tell them sometimes the land nobody wants is exactly the land you needed. Thank you for being here with us today. We will see you in the next story.